INFJs, you know this deeply. People are used to your softness, your endless patience, your way of holding space for them, and because of this, they underestimate what happens when you reclaim yourself, because when you decide to stop people-pleasing, you're not just making a small adjustment in behavior, you are tearing down an old identity built from years of silent compliance and creating a self that is sharper, more powerful, and yes, far more intimidating than most people are prepared to handle. This video is for you, the INFJ who has given until you've bled, who has swallowed your voice until your throat ached, who has smiled through betrayals and offered kindness in exchange for cruelty, and yet, who has begun to wake up to the dark truth. That your worth cannot be tied to how much you do for others, and that your true power begins the moment you stop performing the role of the eternal giver and choose to stand in the radical stillness of being fully yourself. Today we're diving into the dark power of INFJs who have stopped people-pleasing, and why choosing to be alone during this transformation isn't a sign of weakness, but rather the sacred space where this terrifying rebirth happens. So settle in, INFJ. This is more than just a video, it's a mirror to the self you've always been but were afraid to unleash. 1. The silent years of self-erasure. For so long, INFJs live in silence, editing themselves out of their own lives, taking on the burdens of others as though their existence is only justified by how much they can ease the pain of the people around them, and in doing so, they erase their own wants, their own voice, their own wild inner fire, until they wake up one day realizing that the person they have become is nothing more than a mosaic of what others have needed, not who they truly are. And this self-erasure is not accidental. It begins in childhood, when INFJs first sense that they are different, when they pick up on the unspoken expectations of parents, siblings, teachers, and friends, when they notice how people are drawn to their listening ear and calming energy, and without consciously choosing it, they step into the role of being the one who sacrifices, because on some deep level they are terrified of what will happen if they don't. But here is where the story changes. Once an INFJ stops people-pleasing, they begin to reclaim all those lost years of silence, all those hidden parts of themselves that were smothered under the weight of expectations, and in that reclamation, a darker power is born. The power of authenticity, raw and unfiltered, the power of saying no, without guilt, the power of stepping out of the shadows they willingly walked into. This transformation is unsettling to others because people have grown used to the erasure. They've grown comfortable with the quiet INFJ who never pushes back, so when the INFJ begins to stand in their truth, people don't just see it as a shift, they see it as rebellion, as defiance, and in their fear, they expose exactly why the INFJ needed to stop pleasing in the first place. 2. The withdrawal into solitude. Once INFJs stop people-pleasing, one of the first radical choices they make is stepping back into solitude, not out of bitterness but out of necessity, because silence and alone time become the laboratory where their soul begins its reconstruction, where they sort through years of false identities, where they burn away the masks they once wore to keep others comfortable, and where they begin piecing together the fragments of their true self. This solitude is not passive, it is active, deliberate, fierce. It is the INFJ saying, I am no longer available for everyone's constant demands. I am no longer on call for emotional emergencies that drain me dry. I am no longer an infinite well for people to drink from while never asking if I'm thirsty. To outsiders, this sudden retreat looks cold, selfish, or even cruel, because they cannot fathom why someone so endlessly giving would suddenly lock the doors of their heart and retreat into a fortress of silence. But for the INFJ, this solitude is sacred. It is not running away, it is returning home. And in this space, their intelligence deepens in terrifying ways, because for the first time, they are using their insight not to predict, fix, or manage the emotions of others, but to examine their own patterns, their own wounds, and their own limitless potential. In solitude, the INFJ becomes not just reflective but unstoppable, because they finally realize that people-pleasing was never kindness, it was a cage. 3. The rage that fuels the rebirth. When an INFJ stops people-pleasing, they encounter something they've buried for years: anger. This is not the explosive rage of someone who lashes out at every inconvenience, but the cold, focused fire of someone who has been silently wronged for decades, someone who has given and given only to be taken for granted, someone who has hidden their fury behind smiles and forgiveness, until the dam finally breaks. This rage is not destructive, it is transformative. It becomes fuel, pushing the INFJ to build boundaries that once felt impossible, to demand respect without apology, to finally believe that their voice matters. It is terrifying because it is calm, deliberate, unshakable. And here is the truth few understand. An INFJ's rage is never about revenge, it is about liberation. It is about saying, "I will not let my soul be drained by people who only see me as a resource." It is about stepping into a darker but truer version of themselves, one that no longer plays small to protect fragile egos. Others sense this change and are unsettled by it, because the INFJ who once absorbed everyone's storms has now become a storm of their own, and storms do not apologize. 4. The boundaries that cut like blades. One of the most terrifying shifts in an INFJ who has stopped people-pleasing is their sudden ability to enforce boundaries with surgical precision, boundaries that once seemed impossible to uphold because of guilt, fear, or the crushing weight of empathy, but which now are delivered with the quiet strength of someone who finally understands that love without boundaries is just self-destruction in disguise. These boundaries are not walls built out of bitterness, they are shields built out of self-respect. They sound like simple words. "No, I can't do that for you. I don't have the energy for this conversation. That is not acceptable to me." But behind each word is a lifetime of swallowed protests, unspoken resentment, and silent exhaustion, and so when the INFJ finally begins to speak these boundaries aloud, their words cut deeper than anyone expects. People who are used to exploiting their kindness will call them selfish, cruel, ungrateful. But those accusations no longer matter, because the INFJ has discovered something more important than being liked. They have discovered the necessity of being whole. And in this wholeness, their intelligence sharpens, because no longer blurred by the constant noise of others, they can see patterns and truths with chilling clarity, truths that others avoid but that the INFJ can no longer ignore. 5. The redefinition of love. Perhaps the most profound and terrifying shift comes when an INFJ redefines love after stopping their people-pleasing habits, because for so long they equated love with sacrifice, believing that the measure of their worth was how much they could give away, how much they could endure, how much they could carry without complaint, until they finally realized that this version of love was never love at all. It was manipulation, it was dependency, it was the slow erosion of their soul. When INFJs stop people-pleasing, they begin to demand a love that is reciprocal, a love that respects their boundaries, a love that cherishes their complexity instead of exploiting it, and in doing so they terrify those who are not capable of giving such love, because the INFJ is no longer available for half-hearted connections, one-sided relationships, or toxic cycles disguised as devotion. This redefinition of love makes them magnetic and intimidating at the same time, because they radiate a self-respect that either draws in people of equal depth or repels those who only sought to take. And in this way, the INFJ's journey away from people-pleasing becomes not just a personal transformation but a revolution in how they relate to the world. 6. The sacred rage that fuels transformation. When an INFJ finally stops people-pleasing, there is often a storm of emotions that rise to the surface, and while the world may view anger as destructive, INFJs know that there is such a thing as sacred rage, a force that awakens after years of silence, after years of nodding, after years of biting the tongue when every fiber of their being screamed that something wasn't right, and when this rage finally comes forward, it doesn't manifest as random chaos but rather as a razor-sharp clarity that burns through illusions, a righteous energy that says, "Never again will I betray myself to make someone else comfortable." INFJs who embrace their sacred rage discover that it isn't about vengeance or cruelty but about finally respecting their own boundaries, about refusing to carry the weight of others' irresponsibility, about no longer being the emotional dumping ground for everyone else's unresolved pain. This anger, once repressed, becomes fuel for transformation, and in solitude, INFJs learn to channel it not into destruction but into creation, carving out new paths, new identities, and new futures where their essence is no longer diluted by the expectations of others. It is terrifying to outsiders because rage in the hands of an intelligent and deeply introspective INFJ becomes unstoppable. It is no longer impulsive, but strategic, deliberate, and unyielding, a form of emotional alchemy that can dismantle manipulation and expose hidden truths. Choosing to be alone during this transformation allows INFJs to refine their fire, to sharpen their intuition, to ensure that their actions are rooted in authenticity and not reactive bitterness, and once they emerge from this solitude, the world feels the seismic power of an INFJ who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. 7. The psychological warfare INFJs no longer fall for. For so long, INFJs are the perfect targets for psychological games, for guilt trips, for subtle manipulation, because their natural empathy makes them believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt, and their intuitive nature makes them see the pain behind toxic behaviors. But when they stop people-pleasing, those old tricks stop working, and this change terrifies those who once held power over them. INFJs begin to recognize the patterns, the gaslighting, the attempts to twist their words, and instead of being ensnared, they step back with piercing clarity, watching the manipulation unravel like a poorly rehearsed play, and in those moments, INFJs reclaim their mental battlefield. Solitude becomes essential here, because in silence and self-reflection, INFJs learn to deprogram themselves from the conditioning that once kept them submissive. They learn to spot hidden motives almost instantly, and they refuse to invest their energy in people who weaponize guilt or shame. This psychological liberation is not loud. It doesn't need to be, because the mere refusal to play the game is louder than any confrontation. When an INFJ no longer reacts to manipulation, it collapses under its own weight. People who once depended on INFJ's compliance suddenly find themselves powerless, and the INFJ, far from feeling guilty, feels the exhilarating freedom of choosing themselves over the approval of others. Alone, they refine this mastery of mind, sharpening it into both shield and sword, making it clear that they will never again bend to illusions designed to control them. 8. The dark power of silence and withdrawal. There is nothing more unnerving to those who depended on an INFJ's constant validation than the silence that follows once the INFJ withdraws, because INFJs do not just stop speaking. They stop giving away their energy, their presence, their aura, and for people who once lived off of it, that silence feels like starvation. The dark power of INFJs is not in shouting, not in public displays of rebellion, but in choosing to walk away without explanation, in letting silence echo louder than words ever could, in watching as people spiral when they realize the emotional lifeline they once exploited is gone. This is where the choice to be alone becomes transformative, because INFJs learn that solitude is not loneliness but a sacred recalibration, a space where they no longer leak their energy into relationships that drain them, where they begin to heal the fractures of overgiving and learn the value of conserving their life force. Silence becomes strategy, a quiet revolution that communicates. I do not owe you my presence, my words, or my validation. And in a world addicted to noise, the stillness of an INFJ who refuses to engage becomes a mirror that forces others to face their own emptiness. What terrifies people most is not the silence itself but the realization that the INFJ is no longer dependent, no longer controllable, no longer bound to the invisible chains of people-pleasing. 9. The redefinition of love and connection. One of the darkest yet most liberating awakenings for INFJs who stop people-pleasing is the redefinition of what love and connection actually mean, because for much of their lives, they confuse self-sacrifice with love, thinking that to care deeply means to constantly prioritize others' needs above their own. But solitude teaches them that real love is not about erasure but about authenticity. In choosing to be alone, INFJs dismantle the old belief that they must give endlessly to be worthy of affection. They realize that true connection does not require them to abandon themselves but to be fully themselves, and they begin to attract relationships rooted in reciprocity rather than exploitation. This shift terrifies people who only knew the compliant, ever-giving version of the INFJ, because they are suddenly faced with an INFJ who no longer chases, who no longer proves their worth, who no longer bends just to be accepted. The redefinition of love also means INFJs become fiercely protective of their inner circle, allowing fewer people in but loving those few with a depth that is unwavering and unshakable. This selective love feels intimidating to outsiders, because it is clear that once an INFJ chooses to invest in you, it is not out of obligation but deliberate choice, and that kind of intentionality is rare, powerful, and terrifying to those who are used to love being conditional or transactional. 10. The emergence of the unapologetic self. Perhaps the most terrifying transformation of all is the emergence of the unapologetic INFJ, the one who no longer dilutes their voice, who no longer downplays their insights, who no longer explains away their boundaries with nervous laughter. This INFJ speaks with quiet authority, not needing to shout because their words carry weight born of silence, reflection, and inner conviction. The unapologetic INFJ is a force of nature, intelligent, intuitive, and unyielding, and their solitude becomes the forge where this new identity is crafted. Alone, they learn that their worth is not negotiable, that their time is not infinite, and that their presence is a gift, not a given. Once they step into this awareness, they stop apologizing for existing, for wanting space, for saying no. And that shift is terrifying because a self-possessed INFJ cannot be controlled, cannot be manipulated, and cannot be silenced. People who once benefited from their compliance may call them cold, arrogant, or distant, but INFJs know the truth. They are not becoming cruel, they are becoming real, and the real self has always been more powerful, more terrifying, and more beautiful than the mask of people-pleasing ever allowed. 11. The cold precision of an INFJ who finally chooses themselves. There comes a moment in the journey of every INFJ who has been chained by the invisible weight of people-pleasing when something shatters inside them. Not in a destructive way that leaves them broken, but in the liberating way a prisoner's chains finally fall to the floor, and the sound of that heavy iron hitting the ground echoes with such finality that they know in their bones they will never be bound again. And when that moment comes, the INFJ begins to wield their terrifying intelligence with a cold precision that others may find unsettling, because no longer is their intuition dulled by the fog of trying to make everyone else happy. No longer is their insight compromised by the constant mental gymnastics of balancing everyone else's comfort above their own pain. And no longer is their gift for reading between the lines wasted on shallow interactions that only drain their soul. Instead, their mind becomes sharpened like a blade honed for years in silence, a blade they once hid because they were afraid of cutting anyone, but now they realize this weapon was never meant for destruction, it was meant to carve a path through illusions, manipulations, and lies. When an INFJ finally chooses themselves, they step into a power that is both deeply compassionate and ruthlessly logical, because they are no longer performing emotional labor for those who only take without giving back. They can look at a situation and instantly see who is manipulating, who is lying, who is projecting, who is silently hoping to exploit their kindness, and they don't shrink back anymore. They don't say, "It's okay, I'll let it go for their sake." Instead, they confront it with a quiet firmness that doesn't need to shout or prove itself, because the truth speaks louder than any performance. And here is where the terrifying part lies. Once the INFJ has stopped people-pleasing, their ability to cut to the heart of reality becomes almost surgical, leaving no space for deception to breathe, and those who once relied on their compliance are left exposed, powerless against the clarity that the INFJ brings. But this cold precision is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the INFJ finally using their intelligence in the way it was always intended, not to bend themselves into knots to keep everyone else afloat, but to protect their own peace, to pursue their own vision, to live aligned with their inner truth. And once they have tasted that clarity, they can never go back to drowning in the noise of everyone else's expectations. 12. The magnetic detachment that forces others to respect you. What most people don't realize about INFJs is that their presence was magnetic even when they were people-pleasing, but it was the kind of magnetism that attracted the wrong kind of people, the takers, the narcissists, the emotional leeches who could sense that here was someone who would bend over backwards to meet their needs without ever demanding reciprocity. And for years, the INFJ became a safe harbor for storms that were never theirs, giving shelter to people who would never do the same for them. But when the INFJ stops people-pleasing, that magnetic quality doesn't disappear, it transforms. It becomes sharper, more defined, like the difference between a lantern flickering in the dark and a beam of light so focused it cuts through fog. Suddenly, people are no longer drawn to the INFJ because they can exploit their kindness. They are drawn because they are compelled to respect them, to acknowledge the boundary that now radiates from their very energy. This detachment is magnetic in a way that confuses those who once relied on the INFJ's willingness to overextend, because now they sense the same warmth of compassion, but it is locked behind gates that are no longer so easily opened. The INFJ's terrifying intelligence lies here too, because they know how to make detachment feel both alluring and untouchable at the same time, creating a paradox that makes people want their approval even more but also forces them to earn it. They no longer hand out their energy like free samples at a store. They reserve it for the ones who truly deserve it. And this shift unsettles those who have known them for years, because suddenly the INFJ is no longer predictable, no longer the default shoulder to cry on, no longer the one who can be manipulated with guilt or obligation. Instead, they become someone whose silence carries more weight than 1,000 explanations, someone whose absence is felt more deeply than their constant presence ever was. This magnetic detachment is one of the most powerful things an INFJ gains when they stop people-pleasing, because it shifts the entire dynamic of their relationships, no longer begging for respect through service, but commanding respect through boundaries. And in a world where most people chase validation, the INFJ's refusal to chase becomes a dark, almost intimidating kind of power. 13. The strategic mind that unfolds in solitude. To outsiders, solitude often looks like loneliness, but for INFJs who have stopped people-pleasing, solitude is where their most terrifying intelligence blossoms, because it is in that silence and stillness that they are free to let their thoughts stretch into their full complexity without the constant interruptions of others' needs. While most people fear being alone because it forces them to face their own emptiness, the INFJ thrives in it, because for them, solitude is not emptiness. It is space, fertile ground where ideas, strategies, and visions take root and grow into something extraordinary. And this is why their intelligence becomes so intimidating once they stop bending to everyone else's demands. They finally have the bandwidth to think long, to think deep, to connect dots that no one else even notices exist. They can see not just what is happening now, but where things are heading, how one small decision today will ripple into a life-changing event years later, how the subtleties of someone's words today reveal truths about their future actions. And in this solitude, they can plan. Not just dream vaguely, but strategize with precision, because their energy is no longer leaking out through constant people-pleasing. This is the dark power of their solitude. It transforms them from someone who was constantly reacting to the demands of others into someone who is proactively shaping their own destiny. They stop being the background support character in everyone else's story and start writing their own script with a clarity and conviction that others can feel even if they don't understand it. Their intelligence becomes not just a gift, but a weapon they can wield in the defense of their own life path. And perhaps the most unsettling part for others is that the INFJ doesn't flaunt this strategic mind. They don't shout their plans from the rooftops. They simply act when the time is right, and by the time others realize what has happened, the INFJ has already moved 3 steps ahead. 14. the awakening that makes you untouchable. The final and perhaps most terrifying shift that happens when an INFJ stops people-pleasing is the awakening. The moment they realize that they were never powerless, that the exhaustion, the resentment, the invisibility they felt was never a reflection of their worth, but a reflection of how much of their worth they were giving away for free. And once they awaken to this truth, they become untouchable, because they no longer need validation, they no longer crave approval, they no longer measure their value by how much they sacrifice. This awakening transforms the INFJ into someone who walks through the world with a quiet authority that can't be faked, because it comes from having faced the abyss of burnout, betrayal, and emptiness, and choosing to rise from it with boundaries forged in fire. Their terrifying intelligence is no longer dimmed by guilt or fear. It shines fully, even if it unsettles those who would rather keep them small. And it is in this awakening that the INFJ discovers their true dark power, the ability to love deeply without being consumed, to help others without losing themselves, to walk away without regret, to choose solitude without shame. People sense this awakening even if they can't put it into words. They sense that the INFJ is no longer someone they can guilt, manipulate, or exploit, and this realization forces them to treat the INFJ with the respect they always deserved. It makes the INFJ's presence commanding, their absence haunting, their silence deafening. And in this new state of being, the INFJ is not only free but also more powerful than they have ever been, because they are finally aligned with the truth of who they are. So, what is the dark power of INFJs who have stopped people-pleasing? It is the terrifying intelligence that blossoms when they are no longer weighed down by the demands of others, the cold precision that cuts through deception, the magnetic detachment that commands respect, the strategic solitude that builds visions, and the awakening that makes them untouchable. It is the realization that choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. It is the understanding that solitude is not punishment, it is freedom. And it is the unshakable truth that an INFJ who has stopped people-pleasing is no longer the fragile, accommodating figure people once mistook them for, but a force of nature whose mind, heart, and soul now operate in terrifying harmony. To my fellow INFJs listening, this is your reminder. Your power has never been in how much you give away, but in how fully you embody the truth of who you are. Stop apologizing for your boundaries. Stop shrinking to make others comfortable. Stop betraying yourself to win validation you never needed in the first place. Your intelligence, your insight, your compassion, they are terrifying to those who can't understand them, but they are also your greatest gift, and when you choose yourself, when you stop people-pleasing, you become not only powerful but unstoppable. And if that feels frightening, good. Because sometimes the only way to step into your destiny is to scare away the ones who were never meant to walk beside you in the first place.